Hey all, in this module we're going to look at, policy really in the sense of mitigation policy, but ways that we can create incentive or regulation to reduce CO2 output, reduce climate change. So one of the fundamental problems, we talked about economic activity, right? Essentially creating things and consuming things. So that economic activity by design is something that's consuming energy. And so in our current situation, right, in our current world where we have, electricity generation and transportation and all those things tied to CO2 production, economic activity, essentially consumption, creates CO2. Meaning that the creation of wealth or going to kind of do your job creates CO2. So that's where we get into mitigation policy. So how can we create financial incentives primarily to reduce that, right? Because the free market, as it turns out, isn't necessarily capable of doing this. And we'll actually highlight why. We'll see that there's a small kind of hole in what we call externalities. So the free market, free market capitalism, right, driven essentially by profit, there is an issue that we'll get into called externality. And what happens with externality is the repercussions, or essentially the cost, are not incurred by the producer. So in that case, there's essentially no incentive for the producer to lessen their activity or reduce their activity. It's essentially a market failure. And so what we have to do in that case is find something to fill that hole. So one of the big issues, as I was mentioning, is this notion of externality. And the definition of this, essentially in the economics world, is this is something that has an effect beyond the parties involved in the transaction. A really positive example of an externality is a beekeeper, right? So if you're a beekeeper, you keep bees, you manage them, you get your queens, you look at your eggs, you do all your work, and at the end of the season, or sometimes twice in the season, you get to sell your honey, right? Pull the frames out, extract the honey, sell it on the market. Well, in that case, an externality is that those bees actually increase pollination in the surrounding area, right? So that provides benefit for people not considered in the exchange, right? Not the beekeeper nor the person buying the honey, but some other party or parties get the benefit. So that's a really good example. We're going to talk about essentially negative examples of externality. So in our climate example, we're going to talk about how impacts to the atmosphere, the water, the land use, all of those sorts of impacts, they have impacts on the global scale, and that's not necessarily felt directly or incurred a cost by those doing the transaction, essentially creating energy or buying energy, right? There's externalities. And so I'm going to give a bike example, right? We'll talk about a bike factory. So as usual, I'm just going to make up some round numbers to kind of drive the concept home. But let's say we've got a bike factory, we build it, it's beautiful, we love our bikes, we ride them around. They're carbon neutral. Well, at least the usage of them is carbon neutral, not the production. That's what we're going to talk about. So let's say there's a company that makes bikes, makes great bikes, all different colors, all different models, and it costs them on average $400 to make a bike, right? The steel, get all the parts, assemble it, pay the workers. And along the way, that produces some amount of CO2. Now, here's where things get a little bit tricky, because you have to be able to put a dollar value on the CO2, right? So what's the damage of adding CO2 to the atmosphere? There's lots of ways that we can calculate that. One of the things we talked about was stripping CO2 out of the atmosphere. It could cost $300 per ton. So let's say that when we make our bike, it produces 1 ton of CO2, and we've determined that 1 ton of CO2 costs $20 in climate damage, right? So again, I know that it's hard to put a number on that, but let's talk about the CO2 cost. Okay, so again, let's say we're making bikes, 400 bucks. The CO2 damage that we've determined is $40 per ton. I think I actually misspoke in the previous example, so I'm just going to go ahead and use 40. The numbers aren't so important. We're going to talk about the concept. So the true cost of the bike is actually 440, but this 40 is an externality, meaning that's CO2 that was emitted from the factory during the processing, and that's now off into the atmosphere. The company doesn't have to pay that, but as a global citizen, we collectively have to pay that, right? So we've suffered damage from this CO2 emission as an externality. So now, we as a society have borne the cost of this. And let's say that someone comes along with some new bike tech, and they can actually make a bike that costs a little bit more, but doesn't produce any CO2. So someone, at a different company shows up and they say, you know what, we can actually make a bike and we can avoid producing any CO2, but it's going to cost us a little bit more. So we essentially have a carbon neutral bike, and let's say it costs $15 more to produce it in that way. So we would have an extra cost of $15, but this time it's not an externality, right? At this time, the company is paying for it. So now we've got a $415 bike. If we give the company a choice, if we say, okay, which bike are you going to make? The $400 bike or the $415 bike? The company has one decision and they're going to go with money, right? So in this case, even though we could have very clear kind of measurement and understanding of what that externality is, if there's no repercussion for that externality, the company has zero motivation, right? So they could make a carbon neutral bike for a little bit more, but because they incurred no kind of financial penalty for releasing that CO2, there's no reason for them to do that, right? The accountants would just say, well, this is really straightforward. So when we think about these externalities, we could actually think about a few examples. So essentially, in a negative sense, these externalities are kind of degrading a common asset. And in this case, we're talking about the planetary kind of atmospheric system as an asset. But we could even compare this to other things. So if we think about the ocean and we think about kind of commercial fishing, well, if you are catching fish, you're reaping that reward. If we look at the depletion of fish stocks, that affects everyone that's using the fish, right? But it doesn't necessarily affect the company, although maybe they'd catch fewer fish. Another example is deforestation, right? So we talked about maybe in the rainforest, we're removing sections of forest. We oftentimes get a timber sale out of that, so we get one slug of money for selling the timber, and then now we have some new land that we can graze cattle on. And so we've created economic activity, we've produced money, we've produced wealth by removing that forest. And then the externality is that we all now know that that forest can absorb less CO2. And so we've actually kind of reduced part of the that part of the land biosphere that can suck up carbon in the sense of photosynthesis and store it in trees. And we've talked about the fast carbon cycle a whole bunch. But in this case, the company doing the deforestation doesn't have to pay for that, right? They don't have to pay that externality. It's like the heat is hot enough in here, just kick the vent on. I'm sorry for the noise. So thinking about these examples, whether it's a bike shop or a bike factory or a deforestation operation, there's really only two solutions, right? So the solution is you can either have the government step in a variety of ways. That's actually what we're going to talk about in kind of subsequent videos. So the government could step in and say, here's the new law, you got to follow the new law. Or the government could say, here's a financial system we're going to impose upon your industry, and it's going to hopefully promote you to regulate. Or we could just have no regulation, right? So really the only two options are government intervention or nothing, right? Because as we've seen, cash rules everything around us, right? We've been saying that all semester. And in this case, there's clearly no financial incentive to reduce your CO2 output. So that introduces the next big kind of philosophical hurdle that we have to overcome. And this is really when we get into, again, like economic philosophy. I'm not an economics professor, so I'm going to kind of give you my understanding here. But actually, the framework is fairly easy to understand. So there's a few different ways that the government could step in if we were deciding to go with this. And I'm not necessarily, kind of calling out one individual national government. This could also be something done kind of at the UN level, right? So again, I'm not necessarily calling out one individual government. This could be applied to a global system. It's important to kind of pull yourself back from thinking about how a national government would work and kind of think about this at the scale of the planet. Although, again, that might be a bit of a pipe dream. I'm going to outline a few of these. We're going to go in individually and talk about kind of how these different tactics would work. So the first one we're going to talk about is what we call conventional regulation. Another term is control and command and control. In the case of conventional regulation, you just say, here's how much you can emit. That's the rule. If you go over it, you pay a fee, right? So done. You have to produce 15% of your power from solar and 10% from wind. So you could also set kind of diversity requirements, diverse energy portfolio, or purely just emissions caps. And that's good. As we get into that, we're going to see that there are some problems, right? It actually it's not very dynamic. It can't really change how it needs to. So in market-based policy or market-based regulation, this is really where we see a really high capacity to drive change or to affect change. And there's a couple of different things nested inside of here that, again, we're going to go through individually. You could do this with what we call a carbon tax, essentially paying a tax on your emissions, which would then encourage you to reduce your emissions. We'll see there's some interesting math there. Similarly, we can actually do what we call cap and trade, which means there's a certain amount of like these little tokens you can have, polluting tokens, and they have monetary value. You're issued some or you buy some. If you don't use all your tokens, you can sell them to someone else and they use them, but you actually get profit from selling your token. So that's the cap and trade system. Or what we call carbon offsets, which is doing a third activity that consumes carbon that offsets the carbon that you did. Or that you're producing at your factory or whatever the case may be. That's got some problems. Oftentimes that's sold as trees. Like, I planted 10 gazillion trees to offset, which is great. But then your forest burns down. What do you have to do? Do you have to pay that money back? Because now all that carbon is up in the air. And then the last one that we're going to talk about is essentially transparency or information. So if there is a company that's, producing their bicycles or whatever the case may be, and they're polluting less than another bicycle company, that information could actually just be freely available. And so when it came time for you to buy a bike, you could choose which company you want based on the kind of emission information that you have about that company. That again has some problems, which we're going to get into a little bit later. All right, so we're going to kind of back ourselves up and we're going to talk about some of these different ways that we can modify CO2. One of the things to highlight is that market-based is really probably where we see the most capacity to do this. All right, I'll catch you in the next video.